Welcome to the second video on the selection of best method when you're dealing with transfer pricing of intangibles. Now, in the earlier video, we ran through the different methods that are available to you. We're now going to talk about the cut/cup method, cut in the US regs, cup in the OECD guidelines, and what are the issues that are taken into account when thinking about it as the best method. So, oftentimes people want to dismiss a cut or a cup method saying that it has a very high comparability standard. Arguably, it's not really high, it's different. You have to look at different issues on the comparability, and it is true that there are many times when you might not be able to find an uncontrolled transaction that would work. But when it comes to intangibles, especially, often the cut or the cup method may be the most reliable method you can work with. And that's because and I'll repeat this later in the training, but essentially royalties paid for intangibles are often a relatively small part of the total costs. And if you apply many of the other transfer pricing methods, it's going to essentially be hard to have a change in the royalty rate actually have a big impact on profitability, which is both other methods are going to focus on, simply because it's a relatively small part of the total cost. So one needs to really think about using the cut or the cup in the case of intangibles. And what's really important is to consider the profit potential of licensing that intangible, and is that comparable in the uncontrolled transaction? So all that said, I thought the best way to think about this is to walk through an example. And that example is from the regulations. And imagine that there's a company, KY, a US pharmaceutical firm, and it's developed a new drug Z, and that drug treats bad breath, halitosis. So KY has gotten the patents on that drug, and they've now gone through all the clinical trials and testing. They've got the regulatory approval to market the drug in the United States and in foreign countries. So what's going to happen next in this example? Well, let's map the transaction so we can see what's going on. Now, start off with we have KY, which is over in the US. And in this particular example, they're going to license the drug to their subsidiary, since it's owned by them. You can see the lines attaching it, in Spain for the rights to essentially produce and sell this drug Z in Spain for the treatment of bad breath. So that is our controlled transaction. That's what we need to come up with a price for. What should the license fee be, or the royalty rate for that? Now, at the same time, KY has a contract with an external company, an uncontrolled party, third party to it, for the licensing to produce and sell Z in Portugal. And that's an uncontrolled transaction. So this leads us to the question of, can we use essentially that transaction as a cut? So just to summarize things, KY licenses the rights to produce and sell to its related party KP in Spain. It also licenses the rights to produce and sell Z, the same drug, in Portugal to an unrelated party called Externa. And it's got the approval for marketing this drug in the patent rights in both countries, and the approval, regulatory approval, so that the drug can be prescribed in both countries. Similar protection for intellectual property in both countries. And the example goes on to say, well, Spain and Portugal have similar populations, per capita income, and the incidence of the disease halitosis, bad breath. So consequently, Z is expected to sell in similar quantities and at similar prices in both countries. In addition, the cost of producing and marketing Z in each country is expected to be approximately the same. This is a very classic example given in the regs. It's sort of assumed away a lot of the issues. I want to talk about that a little bit. What's the reality check? Well, the reality check is that, in a sense, Spain and Portugal are very similar demographically. They have the same a mix of population, the same age distribution, those sorts of issues, but economically maybe not so much. To start off with, Spain is much bigger than Portugal. Despite what those regulations say, Spain is somewhere between 4 and 5 times the size of Portugal when it comes to population. All right, important to note. Another key issue to keep in mind, Spain has much higher income per capita than does Portugal. So whereas Portugal has an income per capita of about $23,000, Spain it's above $30,000. So that's going to have a factor. And another thing economically is that Portugal actually has the lower unemployment rate. So while it does have lower income, more of its population is employed. You can notice, though, that these are very high unemployment rates. These two economies are still suffering the impact of the 2008 Great Recession. So all that said, we're going to sort of say, take that into account when we think about this, and probably the thing to think about most, more than anything, is going to be the size factor in some ways. KY and KP establish the terms for the license of Z, and those terms are identical in every material aspect, including the royalty rate, to the terms established between KY and Externa. So can we use the comparable transaction that's uncontrolled with Externa as a cut or cup for the charge to KP? Well, the answer for this is probably yes. The countries really are highly similar. Now, we need to have a royalty that takes into account the differences that do exist. So a royalty based on revenues is likely the best, as it would likely address the differences in both income and population. Or a royalty based on units sold may be not quite as good as revenue, but would be very good. The number of units sold is going to be primarily affected by the size of the population, since the incidence of the disease is the same in both populations. However, it's not taking into account an income difference. That might be a small difference in that the lower income country might not be willing to pay as much for a drug that solves the problem of halitosis. The answer could be no. And the reason why I say that is if that royalty, if the payment established on the Externa contract were a flat fee and not based on revenues or units sold, then Spain and Portugal are likely not very comparable, because you'd expect to sell probably around 5 times as much in Spain as you would in Portugal. So there is a time when you might say the contract is completely identical, but there's an important difference between these countries, and it's not adjusted for in how you're pricing the product, and therefore this could become very important to you. So that sort of summarizes the idea of using it as a cup or a cut, if we're using the IRS language. Now, assume that there's a massive outbreak of halitosis in Portugal. What's the impact of that going to be? Well, can we still use the same royalty rate charged in the two? I think this issue is going to be the same as before. If the royalty is based on revenues or units sold, it still may be a pretty good cut. The critical issue is going to be how would this change, would affect the expected profitability of licensing this intangible. If it's clear that that difference between them would change the profitability for the party licensing the intangible, then, or for the party licensing it, meaning the Externa in Portugal licensing it so that they can produce this drug, if it's clear that that's going to be make it much more profitable, and KY would know that before they entered into the transaction, then they would probably demand a higher royalty rate because they know there's this additional profitability there to be had. Now remember, once the contract is signed, it may not be open to a fluctuation, in which case it may just be to the profitability of Externa that something's happened that's created an increased demand for the drug. And for the life of the contract, there's no way that KY can actually modify the price and extract some of that profitability for themselves. So, same answer as before. If the rates take into account, if it's being based upon units sold or revenue, probably okay. If